The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Canterbury as Dr. Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her worn leather satchel and stepped carefully around the muddy puddles that had formed from the previous night's rain. The year was 2024, but as she approached the ancient stone walls of Canterbury Cathedral, she felt as though she was stepping back through centuries of history. At 34, Eleanor had dedicated her life to medieval history, specializing in the daily lives of ordinary people during the Middle Ages, a passion that had earned her recognition as one of Britain's leading food historians. The early October air carried the crisp scent of autumn leaves and the distant aroma of fresh bread from the local bakery, a smell that reminded her why she had chosen this particular morning to begin her most ambitious research project yet. For months, she had been planning to create a comprehensive documentary series about medieval breakfast customs, but she needed more than just academic sources. She needed to experience it, to understand it from the ground up. "Another early morning, Dr. Whitmore?" called out Thomas Hartwell, the elderly cathedral groundskeeper, as he swept the stone steps with methodical precision. His weathered face broke into a knowing smile as he paused his work. "You know me, Thomas," Eleanor replied, pulling her wool coat tighter against the morning chill. "The best discoveries happen when the world is still waking up." She had grown fond of Thomas over the years. His grandfather had been a groundskeeper here too, and the family had passed down stories and observations about the cathedral's history that weren't found in any textbook. "Aye, that they do," Thomas nodded, leaning on his broom. "My grandmother used to say that if you wanted to understand how people really lived back then, you had to think about their stomachs first. Everything else came after they'd figured out how to fill their bellies." Eleanor's eyes lit up with curiosity. This was exactly the kind of insight she hoped to uncover. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a wise woman. Did she ever mention anything specific about what people ate in the mornings?" Thomas chuckled, his breath visible in the cool air. "Oh, she had plenty to say about that. Said her own grandmother remembered stories passed down about how different it all was. No rushing about with coffee and toast like we do now, but you'd know more about the proper history of it all than an old groundskeeper like me. Actually, Thomas, I think you might be surprised by how much your family stories could teach me," Eleanor said earnestly. "Academic texts can only tell us so much. They rarely capture what it actually felt like to live through those times." As they spoke, the cathedral bells began to chime 7 o'clock, their deep, resonant tones echoing across the medieval city. Eleanor felt a familiar thrill at the sound. These same bells had been calling people to prayer and marking the hours for over 800 years. She wondered how many medieval mornings had begun with exactly this sound, and what the people of centuries past had eaten as they prepared for their days. Inside the cathedral's research library, Eleanor spread out her materials on the heavy wooden table that had become her regular workspace. Ancient manuscripts, carefully photographed pages from medieval cookbooks, and her growing collection of notes filled the space around her laptop computer, a jarring juxtaposition of old and new that perfectly represented her work. She opened her laptop and began reviewing her research proposal, the words glowing on the screen in the dim morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. Medieval breakfast customs varied dramatically across social classes and geographical regions, but common assumptions about medieval times often oversimplify a complex period spanning nearly 1,000 years. This documentary series will explore the reality of morning meals from the 11th through 15th centuries, examining not just what people ate, but how social status, seasonal availability, religious practices, and regional traditions shaped the most important meal that many people never actually ate. Eleanor paused at that last phrase. It was one of the most fascinating aspects of her research, the fact that for much of the medieval period, many people, particularly those of higher social standing, considered eating early in the morning to be somewhat gluttonous or unnecessary. The concept of breakfast as we know it today simply didn't exist for large portions of the population. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her research partner, Dr. James Crawford, a culinary archaeologist from Oxford. "Found something interesting in the Winchester Cathedral archives. Can you meet me there tomorrow? Might change everything we thought we knew about medieval morning meals." Eleanor's heart raced with excitement. James had a talent for uncovering documents that other researchers had overlooked, and his discoveries had contributed to several groundbreaking papers about medieval food culture. If he thought something could change everything, it was worth investigating immediately. She quickly typed back, "Absolutely, what kind of discovery?" The response came almost instantly. evidence of a breakfast tradition that predates anything we've documented before. And Eleanor, it involves common people, not just nobility. This could prove that regular morning meals were far more widespread than we ever imagined. Eleanor set down her phone with trembling hands. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that could transform her documentary from an academic exercise into something truly revolutionary. For years, the prevailing understanding had been that medieval breakfast was primarily the domain of laborers who needed early sustenance for physical work, and that most people of means ate their first meal closer to midday. She looked around the quiet library, imagining the monks who had once studied here in the pre-dawn hours, preparing for their morning prayers. What had they eaten? How had they sustained themselves through long hours of copying manuscripts and tending to their religious duties? The questions multiplied in her mind, each one opening new avenues of investigation. Outside, Canterbury was fully awakening. She could hear the sounds of modern life beginning, cars starting, delivery trucks rumbling over ancient streets, the chatter of early commuters heading to work. But in this timeless space, surrounded by centuries-old stone and the weight of history, Eleanor felt connected to something much deeper and more enduring. She pulled out her notebook and began writing by hand, a habit she'd maintained since graduate school. Day 1 of intensive research phase. The question isn't just what medieval people ate for breakfast, it's whether our entire understanding of medieval meal patterns has been shaped by incomplete evidence. If James has found proof of widespread breakfast consumption among common people, it suggests that survival and practicality trumped social conventions more often than we've acknowledged. As she wrote, Eleanor realized that this project was becoming more than just a documentary about food. It was an investigation into how ordinary people lived, survived, and found sustenance in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The simple act of eating breakfast, or not eating it, revealed profound truths about social structure, economic necessity, religious belief, and human adaptability. The morning sun climbed higher, casting colorful patterns through the stained glass onto her workspace. Eleanor smiled as she contemplated the journey ahead. Tomorrow's meeting with James could be the beginning of something extraordinary, a complete re-examination of how we understand daily life in medieval England. She closed her notebook and began packing her materials, already planning the questions she would ask and the research strategies she would employ. Whatever James had discovered in Winchester, Eleanor was ready to follow the evidence wherever it might lead, even if it meant challenging centuries of historical assumptions. The breakfast customs of the Middle Ages were about to reveal their secrets, and Dr. Eleanor Whitmore intended to be the one to share them with the world. The ancient stones of Winchester Cathedral seemed to whisper with centuries of secrets as Dr. Eleanor Whitmore made her way through the early morning shadows toward the cathedral's archive entrance. The October air was even crisper than it had been in Canterbury the day before, and her breath formed small clouds as she walked briskly across the cathedral close. Winchester had always held a special place in her heart. This had been the capital of Anglo-Saxon England, and the cathedral itself sat atop layers of history that stretched back over 1,000 years. Dr. James Crawford was already waiting for her near the archive door, his tall frame hunched slightly as he scrolled through messages on his phone. At 42, James had the kind of scholarly intensity that made him oblivious to everything around him when he was focused on a discovery. His dark hair was disheveled, as if he'd run his hands through it repeatedly, a habit Eleanor had noticed he developed when he was excited about his research. "Eleanor, thank God you're here," James said, looking up with eyes that practically sparkled with anticipation. "I've been here since 6 this morning, and I can barely contain myself. What I found yesterday evening is going to revolutionize everything we thought we knew about medieval eating patterns." "Show me," Eleanor said simply, following him through the heavy wooden door into the cathedral's archive. The familiar smell of ancient parchment and preservation chemicals filled the air, along with the subtle mustiness that seemed to permeate all old libraries. The archive librarian, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, greeted them with a warm but professional smile. She was a woman in her 60s who had dedicated her life to preserving Winchester's historical documents, and she had developed a reputation among researchers for being both incredibly knowledgeable and refreshingly practical about historical research. "Dr. Crawford has been quite beside himself since yesterday evening," Mrs. Thornton said with gentle amusement. "I've never seen anyone get so excited about household account records from the 13th century. "Household accounts?" Eleanor asked, intrigued. Such records were goldmines for historians studying daily life, but they were often overlooked because they seemed mundane compared to royal chronicles or religious texts. James led her to a table where several documents had been carefully laid out under protective glass. These are from the household of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a minor nobleman who lived near Winchester from 1267 to 1294. But Eleanor, look at this. He pointed to a section of carefully preserved parchment covered in medieval Latin script. Eleanor leaned closer, her trained eye quickly scanning the faded ink. As a medieval historian, she could read Latin fluently, but these household accounts required careful interpretation. "These appear to be daily expenditure records," she said slowly, "but why are they so significant?" "Look at the timing of the entries," James said, barely able to contain his excitement. "See how they're organized? There are consistent entries for prima refectio, first meal, that occur at dawn or shortly after. And Eleanor, these aren't just for laborers or servants. The accounts clearly indicate that the entire household, including Sir Geoffrey himself, his wife and their children, participated in these early morning meals." Eleanor's pulse quickened as the implications became clear. Prima refectio was indeed the term for first meal, but medieval scholars had long assumed that for nobility, the first substantial meal of the day typically occurred closer to midday. If these records showed an entire noble household eating regularly at dawn, it challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval dining customs. "But there's more," James continued, turning to another section of the documents. "Look at these inventory records. They list specific foods purchased for these morning meals: bread, ale, cheese, eggs, small beer, pottage grains, dried fish, and even honey cakes on feast days. This isn't just a quick bite before work. This is evidence of structured, planned breakfast meals." Mrs. Thornton approached their table carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion," she said, setting down the tray. "My late husband was a local historian, and he always insisted that the common understanding of medieval meal patterns was incomplete. He used to say that historians focused too much on what the church and nobility wrote about ideal behavior, and not enough on what people actually did." Eleanor accepted a cup of tea gratefully, her mind racing with the implications of James's discovery. "Mrs. Thornton, did your husband ever come across similar records? Other households that might have maintained morning meal traditions?" "Oh yes, indeed he did," Mrs. Thornton replied, settling into a chair beside them. "There are fragmentary records from at least 3 other local households from the same period, all showing similar patterns. But here's what I find most interesting. These households were all located in areas where there was significant agricultural activity. People needed to eat before they began their work in the fields or supervised their estates." James nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly right. What we're seeing here isn't just noble indulgence. It's practical necessity adapted to social circumstances. Sir Geoffrey's household accounts show that the morning meal was timed to coordinate with the day's agricultural work. The entire household ate together before the day's labor began." Eleanor stood up and began pacing, a habit she'd developed when processing complex historical information. This suggests that breakfast customs were far more influenced by practical necessity than by social conventions or religious ideals. The church might have preached about the virtue of fasting until midday, but actual families were making practical decisions about when and how to eat based on their daily responsibilities. "Precisely," James said, pulling out his own notebook filled with cramped handwriting. "And there's something else. Look at the seasonal variations in these records. During harvest time, the morning meals became more substantial, more protein, more bread, additional ale. During winter months, the meals were smaller, but included more preserved foods and what appears to be a warm pottage or porridge." Eleanor paused her pacing and looked at the documents with fresh eyes. "James, what you found here isn't just evidence of medieval breakfast. It's evidence of adaptive meal planning based on seasonal labor demands, agricultural cycles, and family logistics. This is far more sophisticated than the simple narrative of medieval people didn't eat breakfast." Mrs. Thornton smiled knowingly. "My husband would have been delighted to hear you say that. He always maintained that medieval people were far more practical and adaptive than modern historians gave them credit for. They survived in a difficult world by being flexible and responsive to their circumstances." James opened another folder and spread out photographs of additional documents. "Eleanor, there's one more thing that's absolutely fascinating. These household accounts include records of what they called morning provisions for travelers. Sir Geoffrey's household regularly provided dawn meals for people passing through, merchants, pilgrims, other nobility traveling between estates. It suggests that morning meals were not only common but expected as part of hospitality customs. Eleanor sat back down, overwhelmed by the richness of this discovery. What you're describing is evidence of a complete social system built around morning meals, not just individual family customs, but community expectations and hospitality traditions. Exactly, James said, his excitement palpable. And if one minor nobleman's household was maintaining these customs and documenting them so carefully, how many other households were doing the same thing without leaving written records? How many common families were eating morning meals but never had their customs documented because they couldn't write or afford to keep detailed accounts? The implications were staggering. Eleanor realized that they weren't just looking at evidence of medieval breakfast customs. They were uncovering proof that the historical narrative about medieval meal patterns had been fundamentally incomplete. The focus on religious texts and noble court customs had obscured the reality of how ordinary families actually lived and ate. "Mrs. Thornton," Eleanor said suddenly, "do you know if any of these other household records your husband discovered are still accessible? And more importantly, do you think there might be similar documents in other cathedral archives throughout England?" Mrs. Thornton's eyes twinkled with the satisfaction of a librarian who had just inspired serious research. "I believe there are indeed more records waiting to be examined, and I suspect that once you begin looking specifically for evidence of morning meal customs, you'll find far more documentation than previous researchers realized existed." James closed his notebook and looked at Eleanor with determination. "We need to expand this research immediately. What we've found here could be just the beginning. If morning meals were this common and this well documented in 13th century Winchester, we need to investigate what breakfast looked like across different regions, different social classes, and different time periods throughout the medieval era." Eleanor nodded, feeling the familiar thrill of a major historical discovery taking shape. Tomorrow their investigation would deepen, and the true story of medieval breakfast was finally beginning to emerge from centuries of assumptions and incomplete evidence. The rain drummed steadily against the diamond-paned windows of the British Library's medieval manuscripts reading room as Dr. Eleanor Whitmore carefully adjusted the specialized lighting over her workspace. 3 weeks had passed since the Winchester discovery, and she and James had thrown themselves into an intensive investigation that was yielding remarkable results. Today, she was examining a collection of personal letters and diary entries from medieval England that had been donated to the library by various estate sales over the past century. Dr. James Crawford sat at the adjacent table, surrounded by digital scans of monastery records from across England. His laptop screen displayed a spreadsheet he'd created to track patterns in their findings, and the data was painting a picture that neither of them had expected when they'd begun this research. "Eleanor," James whispered, mindful of the library's strict quiet policy, "look at this entry from the Abbey of St. Albans dated 1389. He slid his laptop toward her, pointing to a particular passage he'd highlighted. Eleanor read the Latin text carefully, then looked up with raised eyebrows. "This describes the monk's daily routine, and it specifically mentions panis matutinus, morning bread, served at dawn before Lord's. But I thought monastic rules generally prohibited eating before the main meal of the day." "That's what I thought too," James replied quietly. "But I've found similar references in records from at least 6 different monasteries. It seems that practical necessity often overrode theoretical religious restrictions, especially for communities engaged in physical labor." Eleanor turned back to her own materials, which included a particularly fascinating collection of personal correspondence between family members in 14th century Yorkshire. One letter, written by a merchant's wife named Margot de Ashby to her sister in London, had captured her attention because of its remarkably detailed descriptions of daily life. "My dearest sister," Eleanor read silently, translating the medieval English as she went, "the harvest season keeps us all busy from first light until the sun sets. Thomas insists we all break our fast together before the work begins, as he says empty bellies make for poor judgment in the fields. This morning we had fresh bread with honey, eggs from our hens, and small beer that Sarah brewed last week. Even little William ate his portion before running off to help gather the wheat sheaves." Eleanor felt a thrill of recognition. Here was another piece of evidence supporting what they'd found in Winchester: ordinary families making practical decisions about when and what to eat, regardless of what religious or social authorities might have preferred. At the table behind them, a young graduate student named Rebecca Chen was working on her own research project about medieval women's roles in household management. Eleanor had noticed her over the past few days, and had been impressed by her careful attention to detail and obvious passion for historical research. During the lunch break, Eleanor approached Rebecca in the library's cafe. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but I couldn't help noticing that you're working with some medieval household documents. I'm Dr. Eleanor Whitmore, and I'm researching medieval meal customs with my colleague, Dr. Crawford." Rebecca's face lit up with recognition. "Dr. Whitmore, I've read your papers on medieval daily life. I'm Rebecca Chen, and I'm actually working on my dissertation about women's economic roles in medieval households. I've been finding some interesting references to morning meal preparations in the documents I'm studying." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "What kind of references?" "Well, there are several account books kept by women who managed large households," Rebecca explained, pulling out her notebook. "They include detailed records of food preparation that begins before dawn. One woman, Lady Margaret de Clare, kept incredibly detailed notes about organizing her kitchen staff to prepare what she called the breaking of night's fast for her entire household, including guests and servants." James, who had been listening from a nearby table, joined their conversation. "Rebecca, would you be willing to share some of those details? We are discovering that morning meals were far more common and elaborate than previous scholarship has suggested." Rebecca nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. In fact, Lady Margaret's records show that she planned her morning meals according to the season and the day's planned activities. During harvest time, she ordered larger quantities of bread, cheese, and ale. During winter months, she made sure the kitchens prepared warm pottage and heated wine. And on feast days, she included special items like honey cakes and preserved fruits." Eleanor exchanged a meaningful look with James. This was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. Detailed, practical documentation of how real families actually lived, rather than theoretical discussions of what people should have done according to religious or social ideals. "Rebecca," Eleanor said carefully, "would you be interested in collaborating on this research? What you're finding complements our work perfectly, and I think together we might be able to reconstruct a much more complete picture of medieval morning meal customs." Over the following days, the three researchers worked together with increasing excitement. Rebecca's documents provided crucial evidence about how women organized and managed morning meal preparation, while James's monastery records showed how religious communities adapted their practices to practical necessities. Eleanor's collection of personal letters and diaries revealed the emotional and social aspects of family breakfast customs. One particularly revealing document in Eleanor's collection was a letter from a father to his son, written in 1423. The father, a wool merchant named Robert Kempe, was advising his son about establishing his own household after marriage. "My dear son," Eleanor translated aloud to her colleagues, "remember that a household runs smoothly when everyone begins the day properly fed. Your dear mother always insisted that we break our fast together before the day's work began, and this custom served our family well for 30 years. Do not let modern fashions convince you that morning meals are unnecessary. A man who starts his day hungry makes poor decisions in business and harsh choices with his family." James looked up from his own work with amazement. "Eleanor, that's direct evidence that some people in the early 15th century considered regular morning meals to be traditional, while skipping breakfast was seen as a modern fashion. It's the complete opposite of what we've been taught about medieval eating patterns." Rebecca had been quietly working through a collection of kitchen account books, and she suddenly made a soft exclamation of discovery. "You need to see this," she said, gesturing for Eleanor and James to look at the document she was examining. The account book belonged to the household of Sir William de Ferrers and covered the years 1356 to 1361. But what made it extraordinary was the level of detail it provided about daily meal planning and preparation. "Look at these entries," Rebecca said, pointing to specific lines in the faded text. "Every single day for 5 years, this household prepared what they called morning victuals for an average of 47 people, family members, household staff, and regular guests. The accounts include specific quantities: 12 loaves of bread, 8 gallons of ale, 2 wheels of cheese, 40 eggs when available, and various seasonal additions." Eleanor calculated quickly in her head. "Rebecca, that's evidence of systematic, large-scale breakfast preparation spanning multiple years. This isn't occasional or informal. This is a household where morning meals were an established, expected part of daily routine." James was already pulling up his spreadsheet to add this new data. "When we combine this with everything else we've found, we're looking at evidence from monasteries, noble households, merchant families, and rural communities, all showing consistent patterns of morning meal consumption across different social classes and geographical regions. The implications were profound. For decades, medieval historians had taught that breakfast was uncommon in medieval Europe, practiced mainly by laborers who needed early sustenance for physical work. But the evidence they were uncovering suggested something entirely different, that morning meals were widespread, well-organized, and considered normal by the people who actually lived in medieval times. Helena leaned back in her chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what they were discovering. "We're not just challenging a minor historical detail," she said quietly. "We're uncovering evidence that the entire scholarly understanding of medieval daily life has been based on incomplete sources." Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. "What's particularly interesting is that all of these documents show women playing crucial roles in organizing and managing morning meal preparation. It suggests that breakfast customs were deeply embedded in household management systems that were largely controlled by women." James saved his work and looked at his two colleagues with determination. "We need to take this research to the next level. What we've found here is just the beginning. If morning meals were this common and this well documented in the sources we've examined so far, there must be similar evidence in archives throughout Europe." Eleanor smiled, feeling the familiar excitement of a major historical discovery taking shape. Tomorrow, their investigation would expand even further, and the true complexity of medieval breakfast customs was beginning to emerge from centuries of scholarly assumptions and incomplete research. The medieval world was proving to be far more practical, adaptive, and food-conscious than anyone had previously imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of the Weald and Downland Living Museum in West Sussex as Dr. Eleanor Whitmore pulled her car into the gravel parking area. After 6 weeks of intensive archival research, she, James, and Rebecca had decided they needed to move beyond documents and manuscripts to understand what medieval breakfast actually looked, smelled, and tasted like. The Living Museum, with its collection of authentic medieval buildings and its commitment to historical accuracy, was the perfect place to test their theories in practice. Eleanor stepped out of her car and breathed deeply, immediately noticing the difference from London's urban air. Here, surrounded by carefully preserved medieval structures and traditional farming methods, she could almost imagine herself transported back 7 centuries. The smell of wood smoke drifted from one of the reconstructed houses, mixed with the earthy scents of livestock and freshly turned soil. Dr. James Crawford and Rebecca Chen were already waiting near the museum's main building, along with someone Eleanor hadn't expected to see, Dr. Sarah Blackwood, one of Britain's leading experts in experimental archaeology and historical food recreation. Sarah was a woman in her early 50s, with prematurely grey hair and hands that bore the calluses of someone who spent more time working with medieval tools than sitting in university lecture halls. "Eleanor," James called out as she approached, "I hope you don't mind that I invited Sarah to join us today. When I told her about our discoveries, she immediately offered to help us recreate some of the breakfast meals we've been documenting." Sarah stepped forward with a warm smile and a firm handshake. "Dr. Whitmore, I've been following your research with great interest. What you've uncovered about medieval breakfast customs aligns perfectly with some experimental work I've been doing on medieval cooking methods. I think we can learn a tremendous amount by actually preparing and eating these historical meals." Eleanor felt a surge of excitement. Sarah's reputation for rigorous historical accuracy was legendary among medieval historians, and her involvement would add crucial practical dimension to their research. Rebecca, who had been carrying a large canvas bag, set it down and began pulling out photocopies of the historical documents they'd discovered. "I've organized all the recipes and food lists we've found," she said eagerly. "We have detailed descriptions of morning meals from at least 12 different households, covering a period from 1267 to 1456. Sarah examined the documents with professional interest. "This is remarkable documentation," she said after several minutes. "Most attempts to recreate medieval meals rely on cookbooks written for wealthy households, but what you found here represents real families making practical decisions about daily nutrition. This could be far more authentic than anything we've attempted before." The group made their way to one of the museum's reconstructed medieval houses, a 14th century hall house that had been carefully dismantled from its original location and rebuilt stone by stone. Inside, the Great Hall featured a central hearth with authentic medieval cooking equipment, iron pots, wooden bowls, clay jugs, and the various tools that would have been used to prepare meals 700 years ago. "Let's start with something relatively simple," Sarah suggested, spreading out the historical documents on a wooden table. This record from Sir Geoffrey de Montfort's household mentions bread, ale, cheese and eggs as standard morning fare. Those are ingredients we can source authentically, and the preparation methods are well documented. Eleanor read from one of Margot de Ashby's letters. She mentions bread with honey, eggs from their hens and small beer. But she also says that during harvest time, they added what she calls strengthening pottage, some kind of grain porridge that gave the workers energy for heavy labor. James had been studying the monastery records on his tablet. The St. Albans accounts are very specific about their morning bread. They describe it as dark bread of good substance, probably made from barley or rye rather than wheat, which was more expensive and usually reserved for special occasions. Sarah nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We can make authentic medieval bread using period-appropriate grains and baking methods. For the pottage, several of your documents mention oats and barley cooked with ale instead of water, sometimes with honey or dried fruits added during harvest season." Over the next several hours, the four researchers threw themselves into the practical work of medieval cooking. Sarah demonstrated how to build and maintain a cooking fire using only medieval methods, while Rebecca and Eleanor worked together to grind grain using a hand-operated quern stone. James focused on preparing the other ingredients, carefully measuring quantities based on the household accounts they'd discovered. "The physical effort required is significant," Eleanor observed as she worked the heavy stone grinder. "Just preparing the grain for pottage would have taken considerable time and energy. It makes me understand why households would have wanted to prepare larger quantities and eat substantial portions. The caloric expenditure of food preparation alone would have required significant nutrition." Sarah was tending a large iron pot suspended over the fire, stirring what would become their medieval pottage. "That's exactly right," she said. "Modern people often underestimate the physical demands of medieval daily life. Food preparation wasn't just about nutrition. It was about providing enough energy for people to perform the physically demanding work that survival required." Rebecca had been working with clay vessels to prepare what the historical documents called small beer, a low-alcohol beverage that was safer to drink than water and provided both hydration and calories. "It's fascinating how every element of these morning meals served multiple practical purposes," she observed. "The ale provided safe hydration, calories, and probably some B vitamins. The bread and pottage provided sustained energy from complex carbohydrates. The eggs and cheese provided protein and fat." As the morning progressed, the authentic medieval breakfast began to take shape. The aroma filling the hall house was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in modern kitchens. Earthier, more complex, with the smoky undertones that could only come from cooking over an open fire. James had been quiet for several minutes, carefully observing the cooking process and taking detailed notes. "What strikes me most," he said finally, "is how social this whole process would have been. Based on our documents, these morning meals weren't quick individual affairs. They required coordination, cooperation, and shared effort from multiple family members or household staff." Sarah ladled the finished pottage into wooden bowls and arranged the other components of their historical breakfast on the wooden table. The spread included dark, dense bread made from barley and rye, fresh cheese that had been made using medieval techniques, hard-boiled eggs, and small amounts of honey as sweetening. "Before we eat," Eleanor said, "I want us all to take a moment to consider what we're experiencing. This isn't just a meal, it's a direct connection to how thousands of families lived and sustained themselves across centuries of medieval life." The first taste was revelatory. The pottage was hearty and filling, with a complex flavor that came from the combination of grains, ale, and honey. The bread was denser and more flavorful than modern bread, with a slightly sour tang that spoke of natural fermentation processes. The cheese was sharp and creamy, while the eggs provided familiar comfort in an otherwise unfamiliar meal. "The nutritional profile is actually quite sophisticated," Rebecca noted between bites. "Complex carbohydrates for sustained energy, complete proteins from the eggs and cheese, healthy fats, and the ale would have provided B vitamins and calories. For people facing physical labor, this would have been ideal fuel." Sarah was examining the remaining pottage with professional interest. The texture and consistency would have made this very satisfying. "These aren't empty calories. This is nutritionally dense food designed to keep people satisfied and energized for hours." Eleanor found herself thinking about the families whose breakfast customs they were recreating. When we read about these meals in historical documents, it's easy to think of them as quaint or primitive, but experiencing them directly, I realize how thoughtful and practical these food choices were. Medieval families developed breakfast customs that were perfectly adapted to their nutritional needs, available ingredients, and daily schedules. James raised his mug of small beer in a spontaneous toast. To the medieval families who were far more sophisticated about nutrition and meal planning than history has given them credit for. As they finished their historical breakfast, Eleanor felt a profound sense of connection to the past that no amount of archival research could have provided. They weren't just studying medieval breakfast customs, they were experiencing them, understanding them from the inside out. Tomorrow, their research would take yet another turn as they prepared to share their discoveries with the broader academic community and challenge centuries of assumptions about how medieval people actually lived and ate. The authentic flavors of the past lingered on their tongues as they began planning their next phase of investigation. The lecture hall at Oxford University buzzed with anticipation as Dr. Eleanor Whitmore adjusted her microphone and looked out at the assembled crowd of medieval historians, archaeologists, and food scholars. 3 months had passed since their experimental breakfast at the Weald and Downland Museum, and word of their revolutionary findings had spread throughout academic circles. Today's symposium, titled Rethinking Medieval Meal Patterns, New Evidence for Widespread Breakfast Consumption, would be their first major public presentation of research that was already generating controversy. Eleanor could see familiar faces scattered throughout the audience, colleagues who had supported her work over the years, graduate students eager to hear groundbreaking research, and more than a few senior academics whose skeptical expressions suggested they weren't convinced by preliminary reports they'd heard about her findings. Dr. James Crawford sat in the front row next to Rebecca Chen, both offering encouraging smiles. Behind them, Dr. Sarah Blackwood had set up a small display of medieval cooking implements and authentic food samples that would supplement Eleanor's presentation. The interdisciplinary nature of their research team was itself unusual in medieval studies, where historians, archaeologists, and experimental researchers rarely collaborated so closely. Professor Margaret Ashford, one of Britain's most respected medieval historians and Eleanor's former doctoral advisor, occupied a seat in the third row. At 72, Professor Ashford had spent nearly 5 decades studying medieval social customs, and her 1987 book, Daily Life in Medieval England, remained the standard text on the subject. Eleanor knew that Professor Ashford's reaction to today's presentation would significantly influence how the broader academic community received their research. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system, "for the past century, medieval historians have taught that breakfast was uncommon in medieval Europe, practiced primarily by laborers and considered somewhat improper by people of higher social standing. Today I'm here to present evidence that this fundamental assumption about medieval daily life is incomplete and, in many cases, simply incorrect." A murmur rippled through the audience. Eleanor had expected this reaction. Challenging established historical narratives always provoked strong responses from academic communities. She clicked to her first slide, which displayed a timeline of medieval breakfast references they'd discovered. Working with Dr. James Crawford, Rebecca Chen, and Dr. Sarah Blackwood, we've examined household accounts, personal correspondence, monastery records, and other primary sources from across England, covering the period from 1250 to 1450. What we've found is systematic, widespread evidence of regular morning meal consumption across all social classes. Professor Ashford leaned forward in her seat, her expression intent but unreadable. Eleanor knew her former mentor well enough to recognize signs of serious intellectual engagement rather than dismissive skepticism. "Let me share some specific examples," Eleanor continued, advancing to a slide showing photographs of the Winchester documents. The household accounts of Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, a minor nobleman near Winchester, show daily expenditures for prima refectio, first meal, consumed at dawn by his entire household, including family members, guests, and servants. These aren't occasional entries. They span 27 years of consistent record-keeping. Dr. Harrison Pemberton, a prominent medieval social historian from Cambridge, raised his hand from the middle of the audience. "Dr. Whitmore, while these individual examples are interesting, how do you account for the extensive religious literature that specifically condemns early morning eating as gluttonous behavior? Surely the Church's position on this matter influenced actual practice." Eleanor had anticipated this question and was prepared with a comprehensive response. Dr. Pemberton, that's exactly the kind of assumption our research challenges. We've found evidence that religious ideals and actual family practices often diverged significantly. For example, the Abbey of St. Albans maintained official policies against morning eating while simultaneously keeping detailed accounts of panis matutinus, morning bread, served to their monks before dawn prayers. She clicked to another slide showing monastery records. What we're seeing is that practical necessity often overrode theoretical religious restrictions. Communities engaged in physical labor, whether religious or secular, adapted their eating patterns to support their actual daily activities rather than abstract ideals. Rebecca Chen stood up from her seat in the front row. Eleanor had asked her to be prepared to address questions about the role of women in medieval meal planning, since her research had uncovered crucial evidence about household management practices. If I may add, Rebecca said, addressing the audience, my research into women's roles in medieval household management shows that breakfast planning was deeply integrated into domestic economic systems. Women like Lady Margaret de Clare kept detailed records of morning meal preparation that coordinated with seasonal agricultural demands, family logistics, and hospitality customs. These weren't spontaneous decisions, they were systematic household management practices. Professor Ashford finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of decades of scholarship. Eleanor, your evidence is certainly intriguing, but I'm curious about geographical and temporal variations. Are you suggesting that breakfast consumption was uniform across medieval England, or did practices vary significantly by region, social class, and historical period? Eleanor smiled, recognizing this as exactly the kind of nuanced question that demonstrated serious scholarly engagement rather than reflexive skepticism. Professor Ashford, that's precisely what makes our findings so fascinating. We've identified clear patterns of variation that actually make the evidence more convincing, not less. She advanced to a slide showing their data organized by region and social class. Rural households show higher rates of systematic breakfast consumption, particularly during agricultural seasons. Urban merchant families develop different patterns, often coordinating morning meals with market schedules or trade activities. Noble households varied their practices based on residence patterns, more elaborate morning meals when at their primary estates, simpler practices when traveling. James Crawford stood to add his perspective on the monastery evidence. The religious records show fascinating adaptations to local conditions. Monasteries in agricultural areas maintained more substantial morning meal practices than urban religious communities. Even within single religious orders, practices varied based on the physical demands of each community's daily work. Dr. Pemberton raised his hand again, but his expression had shifted from skepticism to genuine curiosity. Dr. Crawford, are you suggesting that medieval people were more pragmatic about food customs than religious authorities would have preferred? Exactly, James replied. What we're finding is evidence of adaptive, practical decision-making that prioritized survival and efficiency over abstract ideals. Medieval families were far more sophisticated about nutrition and meal planning than previous scholarship has acknowledged. Sarah Blackwood approached the podium with several bowls containing samples of the medieval breakfast foods they'd recreated. If I may, she said, I'd like to offer everyone a chance to taste what these historical morning meals actually involved. As audience members sampled the authentic medieval pottage, bread, and small beer, Eleanor could see expressions of surprise and recognition spreading throughout the hall. The food was more substantial, more flavorful, and more nutritionally sophisticated than most people had expected. Professor Ashford tasted the pottage thoughtfully and nodded with apparent approval. This is quite remarkable, she said. The nutritional profile is clearly designed for people facing significant physical demands. Eleanor, I have to admit that your evidence is compelling enough to warrant serious reconsideration of established assumptions about medieval daily life. The remainder of the presentation proceeded with increasingly engaged discussion rather than skeptical challenges. Eleanor presented their findings about seasonal variations in breakfast customs, the role of hospitality traditions in morning meal practices, and the evidence for widespread breakfast consumption among common people whose eating habits had previously gone undocumented. As the symposium concluded, Eleanor felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. They had successfully presented evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about medieval life, and the academic community had responded with serious intellectual engagement rather than dismissive skepticism. Professor Ashford approached Eleanor as the audience began to disperse. "My dear," she said with obvious pride, "this is exactly the kind of research that advances our field. You've demonstrated that medieval people were more practical, more adaptive, and more sophisticated than we've given them credit for." Rebecca and James joined them, both clearly energized by the positive reception their work had received. Sarah Blackwood was already deep in conversation with several other experimental archaeologists about potential collaborative projects inspired by their research. "What's next?" Rebecca asked, her eyes bright with excitement about future research possibilities. Eleanor looked around at her colleagues and collaborators, then at the lingering groups of academics still discussing their presentation. "Now we expand this research internationally," she said with determination. "If breakfast customs were this widespread and sophisticated in medieval England, we need to investigate what morning meals looked like across medieval Europe." The academic storm they had unleashed was just beginning, and Eleanor knew that their discoveries would continue generating new questions and challenging established historical narratives for years to come. Tomorrow would bring new archives to explore, new evidence to uncover, and new insights into the daily lives of medieval families who had been far more practical and food-conscious than history had previously acknowledged. 6 months after the Oxford Symposium, Dr. Eleanor Whitmore stood in the production studio of the BBC, watching the final edits of what would become a groundbreaking documentary series that was already generating international attention. The green screen behind her had been replaced with digital recreations of medieval kitchens, and the editing team was carefully synchronizing her narration with footage from their experimental cooking sessions and interviews with leading medieval historians from across Europe. The response to their research had been extraordinary. Archaeological teams in France, Germany, and Italy had begun re-examining their own collections for evidence of medieval breakfast customs, and preliminary findings suggested that systematic morning meal consumption had been far more widespread across medieval Europe than anyone had previously imagined. James Crawford entered the studio carrying a thick folder of correspondence and a tablet displaying the latest research updates. His excitement was palpable as he approached Eleanor during a break in filming. "You're not going to believe the latest reports," he said, barely containing his enthusiasm. "The team at the Sorbonne has found evidence of organized breakfast customs in 13th century Paris that are even more elaborate than what we documented in England." Eleanor's eyes widened with interest. Dr. Marie Dubois, a respected medieval historian from the University of Paris, had been one of the first international scholars to take their research seriously and had begun investigating French archives for similar evidence. "What kind of evidence?" Eleanor asked, accepting the tablet to review the preliminary findings. "Household accounts from Parisian merchant families showing coordinated morning meals that included fresh bread, cheese, wine, and what they called potage du matin, morning pottage. But here's what's really remarkable. They found evidence of commercial breakfast vendors operating in Paris markets, selling prepared morning foods to workers and travelers." Eleanor felt the familiar thrill of discovery that had driven her research for the past year. "Commercial breakfast vendors? James, that suggests a level of social and economic organization around morning meals that we never imagined existed." Rebecca Chen approached from across the studio, where she had been reviewing interview footage with the production team. Her doctoral dissertation, now expanded to include their collaborative findings, was being fast-tracked for publication and had already attracted attention from university presses in both Britain and America. "Eleanor, the producer wants to know if you're ready to film the final segment," Rebecca said. "They're particularly excited about including our conclusions about the social and economic implications of widespread breakfast consumption." The final segment of their documentary series would address the broader historical implications of their discoveries. Eleanor had spent weeks crafting a narrative that would help general audiences understand why their findings mattered beyond academic circles. Eleanor took her position in front of the cameras as the production team made final adjustments to lighting and sound equipment. The director, a woman named Catherine Mills, who had previously worked on acclaimed historical documentaries, gave her an encouraging nod. "Dr. Whitmore, whenever you're ready," Catherine said. "Remember, this is your opportunity to help viewers understand what these discoveries mean for our understanding of medieval life in general." Eleanor looked directly into the camera, drawing on months of research, experimentation, and collaboration to distill their findings into clear, accessible language. For over a century, she began, historians have taught that medieval people rarely ate breakfast and that morning meals were considered somewhat improper, except for laborers who needed early sustenance. Our research has revealed that this fundamental assumption was based on incomplete evidence and a misunderstanding of how medieval families actually lived. She paused, letting the significance of that statement settle before continuing. What we've discovered through systematic examination of household accounts, personal correspondence, monastery records, and other primary sources is that regular morning meals were common across all social classes throughout medieval England. More importantly, these breakfast customs were sophisticated, nutritionally sound, and deeply integrated into the social and economic fabric of medieval life. The camera focused on Eleanor's face as she continued, her voice carrying the conviction that came from months of rigorous research. Medieval families weren't primitive or unsophisticated about nutrition. They developed breakfast customs that were perfectly adapted to their daily needs, available ingredients, and social circumstances. They understood that people facing physical labor needed substantial morning nutrition, and they organized their households accordingly. Behind Eleanor, the studio's large monitors displayed images from their experimental cooking sessions, showing the authentic medieval breakfast foods they had recreated using historical recipes and traditional methods. When we actually prepared and ate these historical meals, Eleanor continued, we discovered that medieval breakfast was more nutritionally sophisticated than modern processed breakfast foods. The combination of whole grains, protein, healthy fats, and natural fermentation provided sustained energy and essential nutrients. Catherine signaled for Eleanor to transition to the broader implications of their research. But our discoveries extend far beyond food history, Eleanor said, her tone becoming more reflective. What we've uncovered challenges fundamental assumptions about how medieval people lived, how families organized their daily routines, and how practical necessity shaped social customs. She gestured toward the recreated medieval kitchen set that the production team had constructed. Medieval families were adaptive, practical, and remarkably sophisticated in their approach to daily survival. They made decisions based on real-world needs rather than abstract ideals, and they developed customs that prioritized family welfare and community cooperation. The cameras captured Eleanor's genuine excitement as she discussed the collaborative nature of their research. This project has also demonstrated the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. By combining traditional historical research with experimental archaeology, food science, and practical recreation of historical practices, we've been able to understand medieval life in ways that wouldn't have been possible using any single research method. Catherine called for a brief pause while the cameras repositioned for the final segment. During the break, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as curiosity about medieval breakfast customs had evolved into a comprehensive re-examination of how historians study and understand daily life in the past. James and Rebecca joined her for the final segment, which would feature all three researchers discussing the future implications of their work. Dr. Crawford, Catherine said as filming resumed, what do you think these discoveries mean for medieval historical research more broadly? James faced the camera with the confidence of someone who had spent months defending and expanding their findings. What we've learned is that medieval people were far more practical and adaptive than previous scholarship suggested. Our research methodology, combining archival investigation with practical experimentation, could be applied to virtually any aspect of medieval daily life. Rebecca added her perspective on the social implications of their discoveries. The evidence we've found about women's roles in organizing and managing breakfast customs reveals sophisticated household management systems that historians have previously overlooked. Medieval women were economic managers, nutritional planners, and social coordinators, whose contributions to family survival were far more complex than traditional narratives acknowledge. Eleanor concluded their documentary with a reflection on what their research revealed about human adaptability and practical wisdom. What we've discovered about medieval breakfast is really a story about human ingenuity, she said. Medieval families faced challenges that we can barely imagine: limited food preservation, seasonal scarcity, physical demands that few modern people experience. Yet they developed sustainable, nutritionally sound, socially cohesive meal customs that supported their communities for centuries. She paused, looking directly into the camera with genuine conviction. Perhaps most importantly, our research reminds us that people in the past weren't so different from us. They were practical, caring, and intelligent. They made decisions based on love for their families and concern for their communities. They deserve to be understood on their own terms, rather than through the lens of incomplete evidence or modern assumptions. As filming concluded, Eleanor felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Their research had not only challenged established historical narratives, but had also demonstrated new methodologies for understanding the past. More than that, it had revealed the sophistication, adaptability, and practical wisdom of medieval families who had developed sustainable ways of life that supported their communities across centuries. The documentary would air in 3 months, but Eleanor knew that their real work was just beginning. Archaeological teams across Europe were already applying their research methods to investigate breakfast customs in other medieval cultures, and preliminary findings suggested that systematic morning meal consumption had been a widespread phenomenon throughout medieval civilization. As she left the BBC studio that evening, Eleanor smiled at the thought of medieval families gathering around their hearths 7 centuries ago, sharing practical, nourishing breakfasts that had sustained them through the challenges of daily life. Those families would have been amazed to know that their simple morning meals would eventually teach modern scholars profound lessons about human adaptability, practical wisdom, and the sophisticated ways that ordinary people create sustainable communities. The story of medieval breakfast had become a story about the enduring human capacity for practical innovation, family cooperation, and adaptive survival, lessons that remained as relevant in the 21st century as they had been in the 13th, that were perfectly adapted to their daily needs, available ingredients, and social circumstances. They understood that people facing physical labor needed substantial morning nutrition, and they organized their households accordingly. Behind Eleanor, the studio's large monitors displayed images from their experimental cooking sessions, showing the authentic medieval breakfast foods they had recreated using historical recipes and traditional methods. When we actually prepared and ate these historical meals, Eleanor continued, we discovered that medieval breakfast was more nutritionally sophisticated than modern processed breakfast foods. The combination of whole grains, protein, healthy fats, and natural fermentation provided sustained energy and essential nutrients. Catherine signaled for Eleanor to transition to the broader implications of their research. But our discoveries extend far beyond food history, Eleanor said, her tone becoming more reflective. What we've uncovered challenges fundamental assumptions about how medieval people lived, how families organized their daily routines, and how practical necessity shaped social customs. She gestured toward the recreated medieval kitchen set that the production team had constructed. Medieval families were adaptive, practical, and remarkably sophisticated in their approach to daily survival. They made decisions based on real-world needs rather than abstract ideals, and they developed customs that prioritized family welfare and community cooperation. The cameras captured Eleanor's genuine excitement as she discussed the collaborative nature of their research. This project has also demonstrated the value of interdisciplinary collaboration. By combining traditional historical research with experimental archaeology, food science, and practical recreation of historical practices, we've been able to understand medieval life in ways that wouldn't have been possible using any single research method. Catherine called for a brief pause while the cameras repositioned for the final segment. During the break, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as curiosity about medieval breakfast customs had evolved into a comprehensive re-examination of how historians study and understand daily life in the past. James and Rebecca joined her for the final segment, which would feature all 3 researchers discussing the future implications of their work. Dr. Crawford, Catherine said as filming resumed, what do you think these discoveries mean for medieval historical research more broadly? James faced the camera with the confidence of someone who had spent months defending and expanding their findings. What we've learned is that medieval people were far more practical and adaptive than previous scholarship suggested. Our research methodology, combining archival investigation with practical experimentation, could be applied to virtually any aspect of medieval daily life. Rebecca added her perspective on the social implications of their discoveries. The evidence we've found about women's roles in organizing and managing breakfast customs reveals sophisticated household management systems that historians have previously overlooked. Medieval women were economic managers, nutritional planners, and social coordinators whose contributions to family survival were far more complex than traditional narratives acknowledge. Eleanor concluded their documentary with a reflection on what their research revealed about human adaptability and practical wisdom. What we've discovered about medieval breakfast is really a story about human ingenuity, she said. Medieval families faced challenges that we can barely imagine: limited food preservation, seasonal scarcity, physical demands that few modern people experience. Yet they developed sustainable, nutritionally sound, socially cohesive meal customs that supported their communities for centuries. She paused, looking directly into the camera with genuine conviction. Perhaps most importantly, our research reminds us that people in the past weren't so different from us. They were practical, caring, and intelligent. They made decisions based on love for their families and concern for their communities. They deserve to be understood on their own terms, rather than through the lens of incomplete evidence or modern assumptions. As filming concluded, Eleanor felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Their research had not only challenged established historical narratives, but had also demonstrated new methodologies for understanding the past. More than that, it had revealed the sophistication, adaptability, and practical wisdom of medieval families who had developed sustainable ways of life that supported their communities across centuries. The documentary would air in 3 months, but Eleanor knew that their real work was just beginning. Archaeological teams across Europe were already applying their research methods to investigate breakfast customs in other medieval cultures, and preliminary findings suggested that systematic morning meal consumption had been a widespread phenomenon throughout medieval civilization. As she left the BBC studio that evening, Eleanor smiled at the thought of medieval families gathering around their hearths 7 centuries ago, sharing practical, nourishing breakfasts that had sustained them through the challenges of daily life. Those families would have been amazed to know that their simple morning meals would eventually teach modern scholars profound lessons about human adaptability, practical wisdom, and the sophisticated ways that ordinary people create sustainable communities. The story of medieval breakfast had become a story about the enduring human capacity for practical innovation, family cooperation, and adaptive survival, lessons that remained as relevant in the 21st century as they had been in the 13th.